Good evening. Allow me to wish you a very warm welcome here in the Bruno Kreisky Forum. On behalf of our Secretary General, Magister Sabine Kreuzenbrunner, who apologizes for not being here, but she is ill. My name is Irene Horejs. I'm a former EU ambassador, and I am working here as a curator on a line of events which is called Africa, Dimensions of a Continent. This series was created by Ambassador Georg Lenk, who is no longer with us. So Georg Lenk would have spoken some introductory words to you today. But he suddenly passed away on last 1st September, and he has left us all in deep shock and despair. The Kreisky Forum has lost a very committed board member, a very active curator on the event series on Africa. Africa has lost a tireless advocate knocking on all doors of the Austrian administration. And the African community here in Vienna, and we all have lost a very sincere friend. We will miss him very much. Without Georg, who has brought me to the Bruno Kreisky Forum, I would feel even a bit lost here if it wasn't for the constant support of my colleagues Sonia Kote, who is the one here behind, thank you, and Milan, who managed so brilliantly all the logistical and technical issues of this event. Sonia and Milan, thank you so much for your support. And I am also happy to say that for this event, we have also counted on the support of our friends from Médecins Sans Frontières Austria, Laura Leiser, Markus Bachmann, and all the other colleagues of MSF. Thank you so much for supporting us. So now, just a word regarding the event this evening. In the light of the horrors of war and the immense human suffering around us, in the context of far-reaching changes in global politics and the turmoil around the role of the UN in conflict prevention, around international aid, humanitarian support and development, Ambassador Lenk and myself, we decided some time ago to modify a bit the lens of our African line and to shed light on some critical issues that have shaped so far on how we looked to conflicts and regions of Africa. We always have looked in the search for preserving stability, in conflict prevention, human rights, humanitarian support, and development. But for today, it seems that we are turning away from an even if imperfect search for humanity, the world where priority is given to arms and destruction, as a priority to solve conflicts. Sometimes it feels as if empathy and solidarity and the search for peaceful resolution of conflicts has suddenly vanished. So along the question, where has humanity gone under the Zeitenwende, as Olaf Scholz called it, we have decided to organize a series of events on topics like the future of IHL, the future of international aid, on climate finance, and the multilateral institutions of human rights and others. So we have turned from looking at regions and conflicts in Africa to looking to have a small series of events on focusing on these topics. And all these upcoming events will be, of course, dedicated to the memory also of Georg Lenk. So this evening, we will talk about the future of humanitarian aid and of international humanitarian law, in particular also with regard to rearmament policies in Europe. And I'm glad to welcome a panel of very distinguished experts and practitioners. So they are all experts and practitioners at the same time. Yeah? So Dr. Claude Maon.
Not a doctor. I can be today.
A lawyer in Austria is a doctor.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. So,
who is married to doctor?
is specialized in international humanitarian law, and since 2017, director of the International Legal Department at Médecins Sans Frontières, Brussels. Prior to joining MSF, Claude has worked for several years as an attorney at the Brussels bar and is a specialist on access to justice and fight against immunity for the United Nations Development Programme in several African countries, and is a protection officer with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHCR in Geneva. Knut Dörmann, I'll leave the doctor aside then, so is a senior manager in the International Committee of the Red Cross and has been until recently head of delegation of the ICRC, of the International Committee of the Red Cross, to the EU, to NATO, and to the Kingdom of Belgium. Attention, the ICRC is not to be confused with the National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, but we will come to that later. Shoura Zehetner-Hashemi is a lawyer and an Austrian career diplomat. Shoura has been serving in the Austrian diplomatic service from 2008 to 2023. And since August 1st last year, 23, she is part of the General Secretariat of Amnesty International in Austria. Günther Barnet, Mr. Günther Barnet, is head of department for regional cooperation with Africa and the Middle East in the Austrian Ministry of Defense. So thank you, and one of our partners in this series of events on African conflicts, but also on this one of the IHL. So thank you so much for coming and for being with us this evening. So to start, let us start and go directly into elements about international humanitarian law and the ICRC. The ICRC is a very special organization, a kind of guardian of the international humanitarian law. So, Mr. Dörmann, we have recently had a lot of talking, even in Austrian media, about international law, international humanitarian law, but it may be useful to remind at the beginning of this event its origin, the essence, so the essential elements of IHL, and the scope of validity, and how IHL is translated into action. And maybe you can also say a word about the specifics of your organization, the ICRC, please.
Okay, thanks a lot also for your kind words, and in particular also for the invitation. Very happy to be here. And yeah, okay, say a few words about the ICRC. Well, I think you used the right term, something special. So we always call ourselves, we are sui generis for those who did Latin at the time, because we are under domestic law, we are an association under Swiss law, but we have an international mandate which comes from the Geneva Conventions, which gives a specific role to the ICRC. And why we speak about international humanitarian law, you use the term guardian of IHL, but what states expect from us is threefold in a way. It's one, to work for the faithful application of international humanitarian law in armed conflicts. So it essentially means, and that's important that you bear it in mind also when I talk here, it's normally through confidential bilateral dialogue with the parties to an armed conflict that we try to work for the better respect for international humanitarian law. The second part is then work for a better understanding of international humanitarian law, and then the third part is that traditionally, and this is also part of our mandate, that the ICRC has worked for the preparation of international humanitarian law, the development of international humanitarian law. So we talk about the Geneva Conventions, and indeed the Geneva Conventions were negotiated based on proposals that the ICRC did, and also subsequent treaties of international humanitarian law normally came from the ICRC. Well, you asked me to say a little bit, to set a bit the foundations on international humanitarian law, and I think it's important simply to remind a few things that also in the present discussion are sometimes forgotten. When we talk international humanitarian law, it's the law that applies once an armed conflict has started. So international humanitarian law doesn't say anything about the lawfulness of the use of force. It comes into play once it happens. And what is international humanitarian law meant to do? It's to prevent really senseless suffering during armed conflict, or as I would call it sometimes, to be the last bulwark against barbarity. So that's broadly really what international humanitarian law is meant to do. And I think it's important also to bear in mind when we look at the Geneva Conventions that they were created after the horrors of the Second World War. So it was meant to say also these kind of horrors should not happen again. And let's not forget that these were probably the worst horrors that were happening in mankind, and states were there to agree on a certain minimum code that should apply in any type of armed conflicts. Sometimes these days, and I'm sure we are coming back to that, these kind of precepts are being forgotten. So what does international humanitarian law mean? It's essentially to give protections to persons that do not take a part in hostilities. That's why you have a special regime on the sick and wounded and the shipwrecked. You have a regime for prisoners of war. You have a regime for civilians. So that's about persons and then also the affiliated objects that are being used by, for instance, then civilians. And you have then also special protections for medical personnel and then also humanitarian personnel who would work in armed conflict situations. But it's important to bear in mind, and that's what we are always saying, international humanitarian law was born on the battlefield or was developed on the battlefield, and that's why all the rules, in a way, strike a balance between military necessity and humanitarian considerations, or humanity, if you wish. Because it needs to be realistic in order to be complied with also by the armed forces. So that's a critical thing that needs to be kept in mind. Now, one point that is very important these days, and this is something that we observe far too often now, that states forget a bit that international humanitarian law applies under all circumstances. So the reasons for an armed conflict or the origin of an armed conflict doesn't matter. So when you hear talk, someone was acting in self-defense, which is a pure jus ad bellum, so when you're entitled to use armed force, this is not a criterion for international humanitarian law. It applies under any circumstance. The same limitations apply to the aggressor and to the aggressed. But you hear now quite a lot of confusion in current talk. So that's perhaps important to be reminded these days. You asked me about saying also a little bit about the validity of international humanitarian law. So despite the fact that I think the impression when you look at the news on a daily basis, you see quite a lot of things that are clear and flagrant violations of international humanitarian law. But on the other hand side, nobody has questioned in itself the Geneva Conventions and their validity. So everybody would claim, yes, we have to defend them, but the reality, unfortunately, is different. And that's why we are at a very crucial time at the moment, that discussions are necessary at the moment. And we have also launched, in light of the things that we are observing, a global initiative to enhance or to galvanize the political commitment to international humanitarian law. I can speak about it later on, perhaps. Important to bear in mind with international humanitarian law, and this is linked to enforcement, this is essentially the responsibility of the high contracting parties. That's why the Geneva Conventions start by the high contracting parties respect and ensure respect. So it's very much a domestic responsibility that is there, and not that much international enforcement that the Geneva Conventions have foreseen. So the states need to do domestic implementation. They need to disseminate international humanitarian law. They need to ensure that their armed forces are trained in international humanitarian law. They need to ensure that, and to use now a bit NATO slang, it is education, training, and exercises. That's how you make sure that international humanitarian law is applied. And then there's a role for the others who are not party to the armed conflict, and this is the ensure respect part. So the expectation is as well that international humanitarian law is seen as a common good of all parties. So it means not to contribute to violations of international humanitarian law through action, and then also to use positively their influence to ensure respect for international humanitarian law. Perhaps I stop it here, and I'm sure that we can come to some other points in the course of the discussion.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So if I may just summarize a bit, so the Geneva Convention have the purpose to protect a jus in bello, yeah? Not the jus ad bellum. So I think you made the distinction here. And that the purpose is to protect the lives and dignity of civilians, of medical personnel, of civilian infrastructure, and also of access to humanitarian support and protecting humanitarian workers, if I understand right. Yeah? And so, but in what you say, so after, if one looks at the genesis, so the Geneva Conventions, they have been signed by 96 states. Yeah? So nearly by all of the...
By all states. Yeah.
By all states. So they are universally applicable. Yeah? And so, and in the following, there have been a lot of breaches of humanitarian law. So, but after each humanitarian disaster, so if we think of Bosnia, of Darfur, of Rwanda, to name a few, so the international community has always come together to strengthen, always together saying never again. So, and then either the law was strengthened, new parts of the law were introduced, or the humanitarian system, the UN system was strengthened. So, however, today, so all this seems kind of the brink of collapse. So it looks as if we see it, today's wars, so they seem to be marked by a disregard of international humanitarian law, by deliberate obstruction of aid, so, and the deadly attacks on humanitarian workers. So what you mentioned briefly, the obligations of the contracting parties, but what can they actually do, or what shall they actually do to fulfill these obligations, to ensure also the respect for international law, if they are not part of the conflicting parties?
Yeah. Okay, well, as I said, there's first and foremost the negative obligation that was also recognized not to do any action that would contribute to violations of international humanitarian law by the parties to the conflict. So if there are credible information that, let's say, also armaments or arms would be used to commit violations of international humanitarian law, the transfer of arms needs to stop, which is something that is also reflected in the Arms Trade Treaty. Now, otherwise, how to influence positively? You have a variety of means, and it can go from diplomatic engagement that you have it, and this is something that at least the EU has foreseen as well in the guidelines on ensuring better respect for international humanitarian law that they have adopted. It's to have it regularly in bilateral diplomatic engagement with states. It can go through denunciation, so public statements that are being done. It can go into sanctions. This is something that the EU foresees also as per their treaty. Other states have used it as well, so restrictive measures can be imposed. So there's really a panoply of things that states can do to use their influence upon the parties to an armed conflict. Obviously, this needs to be done consistently, and it's very much then also the appreciation that states will have how best to engage then with conflicting parties. Obviously, probably the leverage that you have or that states have is strongest if you deal with your allies, quite frankly, because that's where the influence lies. That's also why at a certain point when our president was talking at the UN Security Council, in light of what we are seeing now in the world, what you said, we are at the brink of collapse and all the violations, she said it's now time to pick up your phone and to call your allies and to remind them of the law.
So I'm sure that we will come back to that this evening. So, but since IHL is part of the laws of war, so I just, let me ask you, Mr. Barnet. So Austria has ratified the conventions, all the additional protocols. Austria has also ratified the genocide conventions. What are the mechanisms in Austria which have been established to fulfill the obligations under the convention. So who is doing what on IHL regarding division of tasks of ministry? Maybe you can clarify a little bit on that.
Yes, Irene, thank you. But before I come to an answer of your questions, you may allow me 2 remarks at the beginning. We agreed on that.
I do.
First of all, I'm sitting here not as a representative of this government or my ministry in everything I say, because there's a lot of my personal views on that. And I would like to ask you to accept this, because I could never speak about this government or any other ministries regarding the obligations there.
Disclaimer accepted.
Yes, thank you very much. But I don't want to stress it. I start with not our ministry and not the forces. So, but generally you can say the agenda of the Austrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but there are people within this room who know it much better than me, is pushing this agenda. And the agenda goes beyond what our colleague has said before, the narrow IHL, to a much broader view on the question of arms reduction, what kind of weapons should be allowed, not only when war is already happening or armed conflict is already happening, but before. So this is what they do. They push this agenda. Everybody within the Ministry of the Foreign Affairs would say that. They do it, how to say, very engaged for decades. They are looking for the multilateralism, the rule of law, institutions that protect all those things or speak out for that. So this is their general task, and they do it. And I will not judge them on how good they do it. It's up to you to look at that. So what does the military do? I will now concentrate on the military, speaking about my own military and about militaries I know. So this is also so-called military of Western countries, but also as you have this small topic about the so-called third countries, I will also speak about that. So it has already been mentioned that our general, how to say, way on looking at this is putting it into education, training, and exercise. And I give you some small examples. So what does it mean on the topic of education? On the topic of education, it means we try to have soldiers in Western countries, armies, who could be seen as very morally high standing, with a lot of ethical standard. So this is the part of the education. Either we have these people already when they come to us, or we will work on them, find out, and maybe kick out those we think who will never fulfill these standards. Do we do failures? Of course, but this is our general view on that. Secondly, we put it into training and exercise. What do I mean by training? So by training, it starts very, very basically with just normal infantry soldiers, and it goes up to specialized training of legal advisors that we have within the military, or every military should have, and who are part of nearly every international operation or also national operations. And it goes up to the general staff training. So depending on where you are in the military, you should have at least some basic knowledge about what is allowed and what is not allowed. And it goes up to specialist general staff officers and people like me. And then within this training, it starts also with very, very basic thing. I give you an example that also relates to how we train so-called third country, partner countries, so being in a so-called developing world. And I wouldn't judge them because they are good sometimes. So it starts with very, very basic things. It starts, for example, with targets, where you have a target where there is a civilian on, maybe holding a child, and with a target that has maybe a typical other military person with a specific weapon. And then you put people under stress, and then you find out, is he or she capable within the stress of making a division between those different targets and shooting the right or the wrong. So very, very basic things, and it starts with that. And this is what we also try to do on a very, very basic level with so-called third partner countries, when, for example, we were in the European Union training mission in Mali, which didn't work very well, but on a political level, or ongoing at the mission in Mozambique, or you name them. Okay, so very, very basic things, and it goes up to concept development within these forces, and it goes into exercises. And within exercises, you try to calibrate what could happen in the so-called real world, and you will put it into your orders. Yeah? Your order will, any military order would recognize international humanitarian law, basics, but also very specific things like what is in the mandate, what are the rules of engagement, what are you allowed to do in very, very specific situation, or what you are not allowed to do under a given mandate that normally reduces the IHL rules to very, very specific situations on saying you should then act like this and this. Okay, so this is how we generally work. And the last thing is, I don't want to be too long, is on the point of that goes into education. What we do here, and I know a lot of other countries of Western states who are doing the same, is that already in peacetime we are working with non-military institutions, non-governmental organizations, scientific organizations. There are friends, I can call them within this room, who know this process in Austria. I'm one of the fathers of this process since 2012, where we work with those institutions on how would we work together if we are together on the ground. And this gives us an understanding of how non-governmental organizations work, even if there would be no Austrian non-governmental organization in a given operation, but to understand how they see the world, how they act, to better coordinate or cooperate with them. So this is also part of a general idea we have developed over the last years.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's always interesting to hear how things are then translated into practice, or then independently how then they work really on the ground. So let's put these brackets. So Claude Maon, the respect for IHL is absolutely vital for humanitarian organizations who work in conflict situations. If I understand rightly, so this year, 25, has been the deadliest year for humanitarian workers so far. And actually we hear every day about bombing ambulances, hospitals, refugee camps, schools, and the deliberate obstruction of access to food and water. So how can you as a humanitarian organization work under these circumstances? How does your work actually look like? And what can you do as a humanitarian organization to claim accountability if something happens? Please.
I don't know. Yeah, it works. Yeah. Thank you, Irene. Well, first of all, indeed, for the ones who don't or are not familiar exactly with MSF, so I'm sorry, I cannot pronounce it in German. But so Médecins Sans Frontières is fine. So Doctors Without Borders. We are a private funding organization, which we are neutral, impartial, independent and medical organization created in the 70s. Today, so we celebrated our 50th birthday a few years ago. We are present today in more than 70 countries worldwide. And clearly we are proud to be totally financially independent, which we will touch a bit upon later, but it's clear that it's very important to remind that we don't belong to any government or to any foreign policy that would be imposed to us for these particular reasons as well. We are an organization with over 60,000 workers worldwide, also with an expatriate personnel, but a lot of national local resources. And today it's clear that, as Irene said, the work keeps going. But it is extremely difficult, and it's clear that the conditions of our actions are clearly deteriorating. So it is the deadliest year for humanitarian workers, as you mentioned. This is obviously mainly because of the Gaza situation, where only in Gaza we have lost 12 members of our staff. But obviously that doesn't prevent also other incidents in other conflicts, as the face of the current conflict worldwide is absolutely devastating and appalling. We can, of course, mention Sudan, which is totally underreported, which is probably the worst humanitarian situation that of the decade for sure, and it's clear that it's totally underreported. We can also mention the situation in Haiti, which is devastating, the situation in Yemen. A lot, actually, of the surface of the globe is facing conflicts that are extremely dramatic. But facing these dramatic conflict, we also clearly witness that the humanitarian space is really shrinking. So what we call principled humanitarian actors are increasingly squeezed by military and political agendas, and it's more and more difficult for us to actually implement a principled humanitarian action. And when I mention principled, I mean submitted and implemented with the humanitarian principle or under the humanitarian principle that you probably know, but that are indeed based on neutrality, independence, and so on. So the erosion of the legal and political cover that humanitarian work relies on means that actors such as MSF and others, because we are not the only ones, are increasingly left to the whims, if we can say, of belligerent, meaning that we are more and more left to alone to basically negotiate that access, which is normally granted under the Geneva Convention, because we were obviously mentioning all the violation of IHL, etc. But humanitarian access is also a right that is granted to neutral, impartial humanitarian organization as per the Geneva Convention, the ICRC being one of them, MSF considering itself as neutral, impartial, and humanitarian as well, which has never been contested so far, is also an organization that is entitled to make offer of services to different types of conflict worldwide, being accepted or not by the welcoming state, which normally is not supposed to unilaterally refuse that access if the organization is able to demonstrate that neutral, impartial humanitarian capacity, and that actually the humanitarian needs are claimed and evident on behalf of the said crisis. So today, actually, this access is totally piecemeal, is contingent. So it's heavily negotiated at every link of the chain, requiring disproportionate time and resources just to sustain operation and mitigate the risk that we are confronted to on the field. So there is a constant bargaining with multiple actors with never guarantee that these agreements will hold, which was not something that we would have witnessed 10 or 15 years ago. In addition of this, the result of these negotiations is fragile. This is start-stop access that cannot keep up with runaway needs in many of the most severe crises that I mentioned earlier. In addition to all this, there is indeed a growing risk for staff and for patients, with a constant threat to safety, obstruction, and uncertainty. So when we mention that, it means also that we have constant attacks on humanitarian aids, which means, I mean, the clear example that you can have, like indeed bombing hospitals in Gaza, of course, but not only. We had recently, was it like 2 or 3 months ago, we had an MSF hospital bombed in South Sudan, in Old Fangak. In total silence. I mean, I think nobody even spoke about it, probably. It is also not new. Again, this is not a new norm. We know that hospitals have been bombed and will continue to be bombed, but it was less of a trend that is today completely witnessed. I mean, we know that hospitals are bombed very regularly in Ukraine. We know that hospitals have been bombed a lot in Syria. MSF was itself the victims of a huge hospital bombing in Afghanistan 10 years ago in 2015 in Kunduz, where a coalition led by the US Army bombed an MSF hospital in the middle of Afghanistan, making 42 victims. So this is absolutely not new. But what is new is indeed the kind of narrative around those attacks, which once were appearing as mistakes in the fog of war, such as the one in Kunduz. This was the narrative back then. Today, it's like states don't even bother themselves with the narrative. There is a hospital, well, it was not protected any longer. Let's bomb it because Hamas is hiding on it, because this has been witnessed there, and allegedly the hospitals who benefit from the most specific protection under the Geneva Convention and under IHL in general, is allegedly in a situation where it lost its protection because acts harmful to the enemy would have been committed inside the medical premise. Today, it's really something that we witness, which is appalling, which is dramatic, and you were mentioning accountability, where accountability is obviously the big buzzword that everybody is looking for. It is not something that is really reachable in the middle of a war. We know that justice is a different time than emergency saving lives is. But it's clear that the lack of accountability and the lack of answers from the global community is absolutely not helping this not becoming the new norm. And as a medical actor active in the medical sector, we systematically need to fight for this on a daily basis.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this sad report, we have to say. So what we, Shoura Hashemi, so what we are witnessing today is a very, at least from, or let's say it differently. So if we can say after World War II, it was mainly the international community, but led by Western countries mainly, or led very much also by European countries. So we see today a very permissive interpretation of IHL violations, in particular also from the EU and from the US. So third countries accuse the EU of double standards and say you are measuring once, is not the same if Russia is committing a violation than if Israel is committing a violation, and we are not talking about belligerents in Sudan at all. So they accuse the EU of double standards, and many countries even talk about the failure of the EU member states to act. So how do you see this current attitude and this debate contribute to delegitimize international humanitarian law? And do you see a more general movement of withdrawal from human rights commitments? Mm-hmm. Please.
Well, not only third states are accusing the European Union of applying double standards. We as Amnesty are, I personally am accusing the European Union. I would also like to start by describing a bit to the audience what we do, what Amnesty International does. We are an international human rights organization. We are also working in 72 countries at the moment. Our headquarters is in London. And we are, and this is maybe the most interesting fact for you to know, we are kind of a hybrid organization. So we are, on the one hand, an expert organization, writing reports, working with researchers worldwide and fact-checkers and things like that. We have an evidence lab that is working very sophisticated with technicians and hackers, basically. But we are also activists, and this is very important to us. We are frontline defenders, and I think we are quite bold, especially here in Austria or in the German-speaking countries. And coming to your question, what we are witnessing is the total erosion of IHL. So states and unfortunately also states of the European Union, but also other states, in this case Israel a lot, are it's deeply troubling on the one hand. They are not, the regard for international humanitarian law has reduced. And we are seeing that the whole infrastructure that was set up after World War II as a result of the Holocaust is basically eroding. And this is something that we are very openly talking about. We are calling out perpetrators. We are pushing accountability mechanisms. We are trying to push states to, you know, to more better regard of international humanitarian law, because what we see is that it's not only a question of, you know, maybe different legal approaches to IHL, but it directly translates to attacks on civilians. When states show this disregard for IHL, we as Amnesty International or as human rights organizations can observe war crimes and ultimately genocide. What we observe right now at the moment, which is happening right now, live streamed. And this is, I think, the biggest, erosion of IHL that we have witnessed in the last 2 years.
Yeah, and so I think, so we have talked a little bit about, but there is maybe also a kind of general political movement also regarding a withdrawal of the public debate from human rights commitments. So we have also, some countries have even decided to withdraw from the conventions of anti-personnel landmines and cluster munition convention, which is particularly tragic if you think of the harm these weapons are doing. So in the light of what we are saying, and maybe very shortly, Günther Barnet, would you say that IHL is dead?
No, it's changing. It's changing like the global order is changing and the world is changing.
What does that mean?
What does it mean?
So
okay.
This is very...
Okay, I give a quote at the beginning and then I have some examples. You know, it's very difficult at the moment if you have an evening like that or any conferences, not hearing the famous Gramsci quota in the last 2 years. So everybody's speaking about it, saying the old world is dying, the new one is not born, it is the time of monsters. So that's what he said in the 1920s, and it is very familiar at the same time now. So I'm happy that I used this some 2 years ago in a small piece I wrote from after a conference here. No, but that is true. I give you an example. When I started my military career in 1985, I was trained as a platoon commander of an Austrian guerrilla warfare platoon fighting directly at the border between at that time Austria and Czechoslovakia, which was part of, in the Cold War, Czechoslovakia of the Warsaw Pact. So this was easy. We were in the woods, they were driving on the streets, we would attack them. Stop. Full stop. Very easy. Not attacking them in the villages because that would harm Austrian population, which lowered our possibilities for good ambushes. So the ambushes in the north of the Weinviertel are very, very limited. So this was actually not a very good idea, but still we did it. So, but if you look at today's wars, most of them are fought more and more in big cities. So it's completely different fighting in big cities, knowing who's the enemy, even if he does disguise him or she does disguise him, and how to fight in buildings, how to clear buildings even with a given international mandate on that you're allowed to do it, but how do you do it? And I come back to these very, very basic things. So in a normal military conflict between two military parties, clearing such a building would mean for me, if somebody shoots out of a room, I throw a grenade inside. Don't care about him, he's dead or she's dead, doesn't matter. He or she shoot at me first. But if there are civilians inside, okay, still I could maybe apply throwing a grenade under my rule of laws because it's fine, but actually it's a very bad idea because nobody would see it like that. Nobody would say, oh yeah, it was right to do it. Because people would first care about, oh, there have been civilians dying or maybe hurt by just a grenade. So the point is, if you fight these kind of wars, which are, where the enemy is not completely clear as it was in intrastate wars, it is very, very difficult to know what can you do, even if it is allowed, and do what is not very clever. Because what Mao said already about the insurgencies is, the insurgent behaves like a fish in the water with other fish, and you can make no distinction between them. And this is so very difficult in the way you fight. Taking the example of Gaza, defending such a village, it's nearly impossible to position your troops without already breaking the rules that are given by under the IHL. So there are enough buildings that you shouldn't be there, but which is the best building to defend yourself if you're defending against an overwhelming army like the Israelis is. And on the second time, how do they work with their military means? So it is really, really difficult, especially, and that's what I mean by the changing of the environment. The environment is so different than it was fought by some 50 years ago or before.
Okay, thank you. I assume that there might be some contradicting views here on the panel.
I hope so.
So, Claude, please.
Yeah, I think we agree on one thing, which is probably the most important one, is that IHL is not dead. So you started by saying that. I also agree. I think my agreement will stop there. But it's true that IHL is not dead, but it's a lot under attack. But IHL is a living body of law and custom that depends on a constant political commitment and consistent application to remain effective and relevant. So today, clearly, it's obvious that there is less political will to uphold obligation, and this is what is creating this dangerous erosion that we are witnessing. Those violations, they are being allowed. This is clear, and this permissiveness is political. It's not accidental. So when double standards, like the one we are seeing, are corrosive, because states enforce IHL selectively, and then it undermines the universality of the norm and of the law. Violation, even when systematic and clearly deliberate, are met mostly by the states with only rhetoric. And this is really very obvious today. States issue statements of indignation, but stop short of meaningful action. And without enforcement, without practical accountability, IHL risks losing real weight and credibility. And the challenge, and I finish with that, and it's, I think, something that really the ICRC is always saying, and I completely share it, the problem is not IHL, the problem is the political will to enforce it. And the challenge is not the law itself, but the gap between commitments on paper and action in practice.
No, I don't. Sorry, we are a little bit fighting against time here. So, with time. So I want to switch to, so you can always add something to that. So but I want to ask you, Knut, I think this erosion of international humanitarian law and this erosion of protection of humanitarian action comes along with a shrink in finance. So if we are going back over the last decades, so the USA have been the most important contributor in international aid, in finance for international aid. So we're followed closely by some EU member states in humanitarian aid, like Germany, the great provider of humanitarian support, and the EU as a whole. Yeah. So at the beginning of this year, so President Trump has ordered the dissolution of US aid and has kept with it 90% of the international aid, including humanitarian support. So, however, the US was not the only country to do so. So we have the UK, who have started to do so several years ago already. The Netherlands, including Austria, has this year cut more than half of its humanitarian support also. So if we see this, the delegitimization of IHL together with the crisis in humanitarian finance, so what has been the impact on the humanitarian architecture and on humanitarian action? What has been the impact also on the ICRC? So you are also financed by public contribution. And what does it mean for the affected people?
Yes, well, I think it's important to keep in mind the context, and therefore the connection that you made with what we are seeing in the field and the humanitarian concerns that are there. One, we have to bear in mind that in terms of conflictuality, if we look at it from a legal perspective, at the ICRC we count 130 armed conflicts in the world. And they are lasting for decades. So it means an enormous amount of humanitarian concerns. This coupled with more violations and more egregious violations of international humanitarian law than we have seen in the past. We see then also tendencies beyond double standards, but you see as well exceptionalism by states. They find excuses why to do certain things and why international humanitarian law may not be applicable to a particular situation. And you have dehumanization of the enemy, which is very important, which creates, in a way, a framework where you relativize even torture, abuse, and killings. And this is the reality that it was. And then what we see as well, that when you just look at the sheer number of armed conflicts, and you said it at the beginning, political solutions or ending of conflicts is not happening anymore. In the past, it was then very easy to say, well, okay, there's sufficient money, we give it to the humanitarians, and they will then more or less take care of the things, then we have a good conscience about the kind of things. And now the situation changes with the financial situation that is there. So reduced budgets that are there, and we are seeing a trend over years that is there. We at the ICRC, we had our first financial crisis in 2023, where we had to reduce and refocus also our activities. And now it's again a very difficult situation that is there, but this is something that concerns the humanitarian sector as a whole. That's very clear. Obviously, and we have to say it as well, because you spoke about as MSF, you are self-financed. Well, we depend largely on the contributions from states, and it's a sovereign right of states to say yeah, we are reducing funding because we have different needs. It's a sovereign right, but on the other hand side, we have the situation and the humanitarian needs that are growing, and that makes it so unbearable the situation. Now, what does it mean in terms of impact for the ICRC? Where we don't and we can't be in a situation where we have to choose between Goma and Gaza or between Myanmar and Mali. We have a specific mandate to be operational in armed conflicts, and that's where we want to be and need to be, and this is through a refocus of programs that we did very clearly, and we want to play our added value that distinguishes us from other actors. And this is one, to work for the faithful application of international humanitarian law. That's very, very much at the heart of what we're doing. And then to play the role of the neutral intermediary. And what distinguishes us there is that we have the ambition, and normally we achieve by being neutral, to work on both sides of the front lines. So we are focusing on context where our action cannot fail. So the Ukraines and the Gazas and the Sudans and these places where we need to be, and we continue to be there. But nevertheless, we have to do some refocusing of programs. That's pretty clear. A reduction of programs. That's what is happening, and that at a time where humanitarian needs are growing. And I find it interesting because we are talking quite a bit about the EU. 2 or 3 years ago, there was a very strong. It was still under the old EU Commission. And there, Commissioner Lenarčič, in charge of humanitarian aid, was trying to have some kind of enlargement of the donor base. So it was from the 0.7 that you have in terms of ODA when it comes to development aid. He wanted to have something similar for humanitarian aid, which would have been 0.07 for humanitarian aid, compared to the targets that are being set now for the defense budgets, when you compare to. So we are talking about relative tiny fraction, which would make a huge difference then for the populations affected. So the future is clearly dire there for the populations affected, and that's of great concern, obviously for us. This being said, it means also, and this was something that we had to go through also in 23, where we're looking as well at our internal structures. So to be leaner, to be more cost efficient, that was also something that we had to do. But there's so much that you can do ultimately. So it's not that the humanitarian sector would say, no, we have to stay in the old ways of doing. We need to rethink that's true. But look at the context where we are in.
Yeah, thank you. I will just go forward because we have some time pressure, but I just wanted to say a word. So, I think one of the most affected organizations or institutions are also the UN institutions. And the UN institutions, they did not the same thing exactly as NGOs do. So they very often did negotiations, they very often opened the way, so they had other functions. So, and I assume that MSF is sometimes expected to do the work that a UN organization did. Is that so?
I don't know if it's what the UN are doing, but I mean, talking about the crisis of financing, it's clear that MSF not being directly affected by this cutting of funds, because as I said, private funding organization and very lucky to be, which means that we have around 7 million donors worldwide from more than 40 countries in the world. And we run a budget of over 2 billion a year. So today we are not directly affected by these cuts, but as you just said, it's everywhere. It's in Austria, it's in Europe, in every country, the budget for development and humanitarian aid is disappearing. So obviously we are then standing as one of the possibility of humanitarian action that is still on its 2 feet, and so we receive a lot of requests also to actually fill the gaps that are left by the others, the UN or others, which obviously is not something that we can do because we don't have that capacity either. We are not the UN, we are not the ICRC, we are not UNRWA. We have been asked to fulfill the mandate of UNRWA several times since the beginning of the war. Obviously, it's totally ridiculous and surrealist. But even if we are not directly affected, obviously we are extremely worried as well because, as mentioned, is all of a sector which is weakened. So obviously we are part of that sector, so we are weakened as well by ricochet somehow. And also we are scared of being unable to fulfill all these gaps appearing, not to mention some politics that are also shifting, such as the deprioritization of the sexual and reproductive health or all the health related to women worldwide. The fact that, for example, some UN flights will disappear in Africa or elsewhere where we also depend because we also have our planes. ICRC have its own planes, but there are very few organizations that have planes, and we also need to rely on these private UN or organization planes and means of transport. So we have a lot of challenges that obviously will affect us as well, not to mention that also our funding contributing community might also be very much solicited elsewhere and decide also to give money to other organizations, which would be legitimate but very harmful for us.
Yes, thank you. So, Knut, I'm going back to you. So, so if we have this combination, so today we are living in a moment where in Europe we have a context or a narrative of rearmament. So states are talking about rearmament, about increasing military capacities. NATO is setting a higher goal of financing under the pressure of the US, but not only. Also because we are talking about kind of the possibility of future conflicts. So in this context, it seems a little bit odd or completely contradictory that the countries are losing out on IHL and on finance, on humanitarian capacities, as IHL could even be important for civilians in Europe. IHL could be important, humanitarian support could be important also for civilians in Europe if we may be affected even by conflict. So in that, I understand that you are involved also in this projection, or are you somehow involved also in discussions, or is there any political discussions about how to strengthen IHL in that context?
Well, I think we all observe it that geopolitical tensions that we are witnessing in different parts of the world, be it in Asia Pacific, be it also in Eurasia, at least through discourse, one gets the impression that the world is preparing for even more war than we have. I spoke about the 130 armed conflicts that are going on, and now the narrative is a bit, yeah, there's more to come. And now, in particular, with a narrative about large-scale international armed conflicts, so with the possibility of what the military would call peer-to-peer conflicts or next-to-peer conflicts, so conflict between states. So this is, in a way, well, you spoke about the environment is changing. I think there's now, again, a situation where international armed conflict is seen as a possibility, to say the least. And our responsibility would certainly be to call for de-escalation, because we know what the horrors of armed conflicts would mean. That's the first step, and don't create a self-fulfilling prophecy by making too much there. Now, where we come in, then, in addition to saying these kind of things, for us, it means if you think that something may be happening tying to what you're saying, at the same time, it's not just preparing for war, it is prepare to comply with international humanitarian law. And that's the difference from the past, where we had what was called counterinsurgency operations, where we had counterterrorism operations, which were armed conflicts that were abroad, non-international armed conflicts. Now the possibility that it may happen also on your homeland. So I'm asking, well, I could probably then ask you as well. So what is there in terms of preparedness, for instance, because if there's an international armed conflict, you may capture prisoners of war. So what kind of infrastructure would you have? Would you have then internment camps that are available? Or to start even earlier, and this was a big thing in the Ukraine-Russia international armed conflict, does every country have a national information bureau? A national information bureau is there to collect information about wounded and sick, the dead, the prisoners of war, and the detained. This information is then given to the Central Tracing Agency, which is the ICRC, and the ICRC would inform then the other side. Also the families, because you can imagine the anxiety of the families if someone is going missing. In Russia, the latest figures were 154,000, I think, people missing and there. And this is something that you're not creating, these systems and processes, you're not creating during an armed conflict. You have to do it in peacetime. So that's in a way where certainly the ICRC would come into play, also with our, let's say, prevention work that we are doing, to encourage states also to prepare in peacetime, that they have the possibility to comply with international humanitarian law during an armed conflict. Only if you do it during peacetime, you stand a chance to do it. So we would say, yeah, if you increase your all the financing for rearming, for reshaping your armed forces, budget at the same time for compliance with international humanitarian law, because that has to go hand in hand if you're serious about it. And this also for the sake of your own population. I'm just asking how many states have invested in civil defense, in civilian protection, shelters and the like.
If you want the peace, prepare the war, including on that field somehow.
Sorry, one sentence. I think, Günther, there was a question to you in that. So I assume that the Austrian Ministry of Defense is involved in this kind of discussions about rearmament. So, and looking at it from the civilian point of view, so my question would be, is there also, are there also voices to uphold importance of IHL, or is there also discussion about how to strengthen protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure?
Difficult question, because what are we speaking about? Are we speaking about what Knut now said, a new possibility of an interstate war between whomever, the West and the Russians, let's say it like that, and Austria being not part of the NATO, but within the European Union, what we will call military rear area operation, expecting maybe that Russia would also attack us for what reasons ever, as they mentioned over the last weeks. And then it's about the question, who is here fighting against us, if there is somebody fighting against us within our civilian environment, which is clearly completely different than being invaded or something like that. So these are complete different scenarios. But from a political point of view, the topic goes more between, do we use more budget for rearm military and by that not having enough money for whatever, humanitarian support, development. But I think this is, I don't like this discussion, because it could also go into, okay, why don't we have money for pension systems in Austria or something like that? It's always...
the question was more if in the context of rearmament there is also the question of how to strengthen IHL and respect for IHL.
No, from our point of view, rearmament means that we have capable forces. And if you have capable forces, you could either defend your country because it is necessary of defending it against somebody in a very nation-state war, or are you protecting your forces into crisis areas for having, whatever you want to call it, stability or whatever, that others can work there. So actually this is not a great topic at the moment on a political level, because since Afghanistan or before, we are disengaging. The West is disengaging, and especially Europe is disengaging in the crisis areas from Afghanistan up to now wherever. And it doesn't mean monetarily or also with forces. There has never been an idea of using military forces. In Gaza it would be very difficult, but in Libya it would have been much more easy 10 years ago or something. Okay, creating a safe space in some given areas in Libya, making people from sub-Saharan states or whoever who flee to Libya, giving support that they are not in the hand of criminal gangs or whatever. And secondly, by securing the harbors, making it much more difficult to either get illegally oil out of Libya or get illegally weapons in, okay? Because only when you're on the sea, that's not enough. So the Italians raised it up, and everybody else in the European Union thought they are completely crazy. I mean, they weren't crazy. It was a good idea. I don't know if we could done it in the Italians. I don't know if we would have done it in a proper way. Maybe we would have done it in an awful way, but still it would have been needed to discuss. But there's no discussion at this at the moment. We are disengaging in every mission. We closed MINUSMA. There are no European forces nearly in South Sudan or in MINUSCA or in MONUSCO, the three other big integrated missions of the UN. And maybe we will close at least one or two of them in the next years, because by not financing it. I don't see a discussion about when UNIFIL leaves the Lebanon, what will the European Union then do? Because there is no vacuum. If one force leaves, there is no vacuum. Somebody else will be there. We saw it in the Sahel. When we left, somebody else came in. They might be more worse than me. There might be more criminals than our forces. Okay? So if we are disengaging, maybe we didn't do it very well, but disengaging from crisis regions, from Western states, is a failure overall. But there is no political discussion because of that. Oh, we have to prepare for a war, which is, from my point of view, complete nonsense. But I would never have said it openly in my ministry. No, I still do it.
But you do it.
I do it. I do it there.
Okay.
I do it there.
Thank you very much for that word. I think so. So which leaves me to Shoura. Shoura, how do you see? So we heard now. So this is all. This topic is. You said nonsense. But how can? Do you see a possible way of action to strengthen the respect of IHL today? So it's very much also in your work, I think, and the strengthening of international law. So what do you think about juridical claims? There are some claims from lawyers to hold accountable even the EU for failing to act. What can civil society do? So in the 80s, we had a peace movement, eine Friedensbewegung. So we don't have that now. So will we need one? So maybe. So the floor is yours. You have the last intervention before we are giving.
I'm not sure if we don't have a peace movement right now, because I've said before, I'm an activist. So we at Amnesty International, we are also activists. And this is the beauty of activism, is that you can actually do something. And I would say at the moment, we do have a peace movement when it comes to Gaza. There is a global movement emerging worldwide. People are on the streets basically every day fighting against this genocide, and I would call that a peace movement. Maybe it's not the strongest movement in Austria, in Vienna, but in many, many other countries, when we look at Spain yesterday or today, so there is happening a lot. I would say it's a movement of civil disobedience. disobedience, which is also important to us because we are a non-violent movement, of course. So I think there's happening a lot. When it comes to strengthening IHL, it ultimately lies within the responsibility of states, and we are, as Amnesty International, we are of course trying to push states towards that direction. I have to admit it's very difficult when it comes to the Austrian government. It's a total disaster at the moment when I think about Gaza. But there are other countries. There are countries like Spain, there is Ireland, there is Belgium. So we're trying to, you know, engage with those actors, and when we target other actors. So on our front, we are doing a lot. Also with our reports, we're trying to push states. We had a bombshell report, our genocide report last year, that I think personally changed the discourse also in German-speaking countries. It's not enough. It's not enough because we are witnessing a genocide nonetheless. But the peace movement that you were asking about, I think it's there, and I think it's growing every day. And what we see with Amnesty is that there is a major gap between what the establishment, the political establishment, especially in German-speaking countries, thinks and talks about and says, and what civil society thinks and talks about and says. And we are actively working with civil society and strengthening civil society actors.
Thank you. I think it's a good work to leave us to make the connection, to open the questions to the floor. So please.